Today we take the first steps in expanding our Factions Compared series to the greater whole of science fiction, with a look at the navies of the First Order, Mass Effect Systems Alliance, UNSC, and Covenant Empire. Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another episode of Factions Compared. Today we're looking at the navies of various science fiction factions to try to figure out which one is best. Before I get into things any deeper, this video does not contain any spoilers for The Last Jedi. In talking about the First Order, I will only bring up any information which was publicly released by Disney before Episode 8. For those who don't know, in this series we examine different factions based on objective criteria, or at least somewhat objective. So today when looking at the best navy, we're not focusing on the faction that actually possessed the most naval power, which allows us to correct for differences in technology and universe size, but instead we're looking at the one that makes the most sense and is most well organized. If you're not exactly sure what I mean and you'd like to just see a Star Wars matchup only, feel free to check out the link to the playlist that I've put down in the description, where you can watch one of the 4 episodes focused on the Empire, Rebel Alliance, Confederacy, and Republic. With all of that out of the way, let's get right into the content. We'll look first at one of my favorite factions in science fiction, the United Nations Space Command and their navy. Because the actual quality of technology here isn't as important as it would be in an ordinary versus battle, the distinction between pre-war and post-war UNSC is a bit more blurred. Nonetheless, as we saw when we looked at the Rebel Alliance and the Galactic Empire, the availability of resources does have a bearing on naval doctrine and organization. I'd like to take the UNSC at its height, so we'll look at the Navy after the war. The main change this brings, other than the retrofitting of older ships, is the introduction of the UNSC Infinity and the creation of several new ship lines, mostly cruisers and frigates. Although average ships were more common after the war, the general structure of a UNSC fleet didn't change significantly. UNSC battle groups are actually structured in a very sensible way as that relates to both resource management and strategy. A full UNSC fleet would likely have at its center one or more command ships. These were typically well-armored heavy carriers. On occasion, a ship would instead be led by something smaller, like a Marathon-class cruiser or something between a cruiser and a carrier, or on occasion, a dedicated battleship, like the Infinity. Still, the presence of carriers at the center of most fleets was fairly common. The offensive backbone of the formation would have been the cruisers. Cruisers in the Halo universe are basically built around the central Mac cannon, not focusing on carrying fighters or anything else other than giving out a lot of punishment and taking a beating. Supporting the cruisers would be a large number of small combat and support ships. The most common combat ships in the UNSC fleet were frigates and destroyers, with destroyers being more built for offensive maneuvers and frigates being multi-role vessels. The UNSC also made heavy use of corvettes, which were extremely fast and could screen effectively against enemy fighters. All in all, a standard UNSC battle group was organized in a pyramid structure, with a large number of frigates, a smaller number of heavy-hitting cruisers, and then usually carriers. Starfighters were brought into battle, cruisers would sometimes have a few on board, but carriers would be the primary way that they were transported, although the UNSC admittedly focused on a few fighters instead of having specialized forces. The broadsword and the longsword were the 2 most common fighters used by the UNSC, and they would both be described as multi-role fighters. They didn't really use dedicated heavy bombers or space superiority fighters. That being said, both fighter types did carry very powerful munitions on board. The weapons of the UNSC Navy were also sensible. Most ships would use Mac cannons, and that would be the primary offensive weapon. However, they also did make use of flak cannons, missiles, and other ordnance. All in all, the UNSC Navy has a variety of ships, a focus on specialization. I think their biggest downfall is, besides for the Infinity at least, a lack of really high-powered battleships. Admittedly, the UNSC does focus on numbers, but I still think the presence of dreadnoughts, or at least something larger than a cruiser or even a heavy cruiser, would really help out many UNSC fleets. The larger ships are typically carrier-focused. That makes sense, but carriers do not have the same type of firepower as a dedicated combat ship. Next is our second Halo faction from today's video, the Covenant. The most interesting thing about the Covenant is that each one of their fleets is supposed to be able to serve indefinitely as an independent fighting force. This necessitates a sort of well-roundedness. The fleet will need battleships, support ships, smaller frigates and cruisers, and even ships capable of glassing enemy worlds. Like with the UNSC, the center of a Covenant battle group was typically one or more carriers. These would most often be CAS class carriers, although rarely you would see the massive 20+ kilometer long CSO. I think Covenant carriers, more than the UNSC, had a focus on weapons. You often would see a CAS leading a fight against an enemy. Below that, UNSC and Covenant naval doctrine did differ significantly. While both factions played an emphasis on a support fleet, the Covenant relied very heavily on their CCS-class cruisers. While Covenant battlegroups were heavily customized depending on the ministry they fell under and their purpose, CCS-class cruisers were typically the most common regardless. Frigates and other cruiser types were present within the Navy, however, the Covenant weren't like the UNSC, relying on an overwhelming number of smaller ships. Other cruiser types and things like destroyers or smaller carriers were, in my mind, also less common. From a doctrinal and a structural perspective, I tend to think of an over-reliance on one ship type as a bad thing. Although the CCS is effective both offensive and defensively, by having ships do everything, you lose on some of the specialization, which can give you a tactical advantage. Overall, I'd say the Covenant's use of specialized, self-reliant, independent fleets is a good thing. However, from a practical point, I wish the variance in fleets was more than just changing the ratio of CCS-class cruisers to CAS-class carriers. At this point, I think it's worth noting, and we kind of saw this pop up in some of the Star Wars videos, that the structure of a navy or military, or really any aspect of a faction, will be somewhat dictated by the events and circumstances of that faction and the universe which it inhabits. Although that is somewhat regrettable, it's ultimately unavoidable when measuring factions based on some sort of objective criteria. Next, we have another sensibly designed navy, looking at the Systems Alliance, or the humans, from the Mass Effect series. Although small strike forces would be comprised of perhaps only small or medium-sized ships, any major Alliance fleet would have been centered by a dreadnought. Dreadnoughts, however, would have been extremely rare, and they were precious resources, so you would never have had more than one within a given battle group unless multiple fleets came together. Supporting dreadnoughts would have been cruisers, which were rare but not nearly as rare as dreadnoughts. Cruisers would have made up, like in the Halo universe, much of the firepower of any given fleet. Alongside cruisers were carriers, which, quite sensibly, deployed fighters from long range without entering heavy battle themselves. Below that would have been the most common ship, the frigate. Here we see an interesting mix of Covenant and UNSC naval doctrine. Like the UNSC, there's the heavy use of a small ship, but like the Covenant, we see a ship which does a lot of different things. Frigates are used in groups not only to protect larger ships, but also to harass the enemy. And I like that it's the frigate which takes on this multi-role responsibility. Unlike the Covenant, where the cruiser basically has to do everything, in the Systems Alliance, cruisers focus on dishing out firepower, something that smaller ships can't do, while those smaller ships do everything else. Admittedly, that everything else that I just mentioned also includes things that small, nimble ships are probably better at anyways. That includes screening against fighters, using speed to gain tactical advantages, and harassing large enemy ships. I wish the System Alliance had more ship types within each category, but I like that the fleet is built around an offensively minded dreadnought. I like that carriers focus on bringing ships into battle and not actually fighting themselves. I like that cruisers also focus on offense, and I like that small, numerous frigates are responsible for everything else, and that they work together in packs. Notably, the Systems Alliance also has two different types of strike craft, with one type focused on fighting enemy fighters and the other on attacking capital ships. Finally, we have the First Order, and to be completely honest, I've only included them because I thought you guys might be interested, with The Last Jedi only days away. We don't know much about the First Order, but what we do know doesn't really impress me. Their fleet is mostly comprised, apparently, of Resurgent-class battlecruisers. In the comics, we do see other ships, and presumably they also use Imperial Star Destroyers, but Resurgents seem to be far and away their most common ship. Now, don't get me wrong, the Resurgent is actually a great ship. It does a good job carrying starfighters into battle, it has good weaponry, good shields, it's large. However, I don't like when a fleet focuses on one ship only. That was one of the major issues with the Galactic Empire. Smaller ships are needed to do things like screen against fighters, for example. We do know that they have the Supremacy, a huge flagship, but that doesn't really address the tactical issues I just mentioned. Neither does the Mandator 4, which seems to be focused on orbital bombardment. The First Order Starfighter Corps is also missing a bomber, at least at this point. We see that in Star Wars Battlefront 2, and really, it's just baffling. All in all, the fleet structure of the First Order basically matches that of the Empire, however, their battleships are better. If you want to learn more about the Resurgent, check out Space Doc's video. He does a great job of going over the ship in detail. With this basic understanding of the 4 factions, let's now rank them. Coming in at number 1 is the system's Alliance fleet. Having the Dreadnought be the center of your battle group, supported by heavy-hitting cruisers and multi-role frigates, is a great setup. I also like how their carriers don't try to masquerade as other ship types. And at number 2 is the UNSC. I like that they are also very heavily specialized with different ship types. I'm not a huge fan of the fact that they only have a few types of starfighters, but I can look past that. I think the thing that would have pushed the UNSC to the number 1 spot is having more common dedicated dreadnoughts or battlecruiser type ships like the system's Alliance. Coming in at number 3 then is the Covenant, which still in my opinion has a fairly sound fleet structure. I like how each fleet can operate independently and seems to be relatively hand-picked, but I don't like the over-reliance on the CCS and the CSO. Finally, we have the First Order, which so far at least has repeated some of the same mistakes of the Empire, relying too heavily on a single ship type. Presumably more ships will be added, but for now, they are the least well-structured fleet of these 4 factions. But these are all just my opinions. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Also, don't forget to let me know any ideas you may have for future videos. I'd like to do a versus soon, I'd like to do a lore video, I'd like to keep up with this series, so don't forget to comment down below. Also, I want to thank you guys once again for helping me to reach 100,000 subscribers. You guys have blown my mind with your support, and I love you all. Thanks for watching, guys. As always, this has been EckhartsLadder. May the Force be with you.